Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. I promise I'm done with the 10K celebration videos now. It's time to get back to the usual creationist garbage. Today I'm looking at a video from Pursuit of Reality in which he responds to one of those 7 times atheists totally annihilated religion type videos. I don't really like those videos myself, as they usually seem to value the snappy retort over the well-thought-out response, which can be fun at times, but the snappy retorts usually contain some sort of fallacy or other, so let's see if I can set the record straight.
There's a YouTube channel called ScienceNet that does various videos promoting atheism, and earlier this year they did a video titled 7 Times Atheists Went Next Level Beast Mode, and it had some common arguments from atheists, so I figured we'd do a response video on it. Let's take a look at the first clip.
Since neither can know, you've got to be agnostic. Well, okay, that's fair enough, but do you, follow the same rules with fairies and Santa? No, you don't.
Okay, and this is something that I see atheists try to use pretty often, and I'm always surprised, considering the obvious flaw in trying to compare fairies and Santa to the existence of the all-powerful creator of the universe.
Well, let me try to help you understand. There is no evidence for fairies or Santa, just as there is no evidence for a god or gods. The only thing that could be called evidence for a god is just the god of the gaps, as in, we haven't quite figured out how something happened naturally yet, therefore God did it. At its core, this is simply an assertion with nothing to back it up.
But aside from that, let's break down the actual argument they're trying to make here. What they're trying to say is that the existence of God is irrelevant, or only as relevant as the existence of goblins or fairies.
Relevance has nothing to do with it. Also, relevant to what? Something isn't just universally relevant, it has to be relevant with respect to something. For instance, the existence of Santa is relevant when discussing what happened to the cookies I left out on Christmas Eve. Whether or not God exists is not relevant to that conversation. So what are you thinking of in which God's existence is more relevant than Santa or fairies? The creation of the universe? In that case, it is relevant. If God exists and wants us to know about him, then we would expect to see some kind of evidence pointing to a creator when examining the processes of how the universe ended up like it is today. But since we don't see any evidence, or at least not any clear evidence for the existence of a god, then there is no reason to assume that one exists.
But the flaw here is that there are 2 requirements when deciding if the existence of something supernatural is relevant. The first question of relevance is, does this supernatural being have authority over me?
How is any authority that the supernatural being may or may not have relevant to the overall relevance of the supernatural being in general? I don't see how that could possibly matter.
Is it some kind of higher power?
Does just the fact of being a higher power automatically give this higher power authority? Now, I would suggest that if Santa Claus exists, he would be a higher power, simply based on the fact that he has the power to visit every child in the world over the span of a few hours, while still being able to enjoy millions of cookies and glasses of milk. Does that mean that Santa Claus has authority over me if he exists? Must we submit to stronger powers based solely on the fact that they are stronger? I'm sorry, but I don't believe that submitting to the stronger power is always necessary, and it's a good thing that some people agree with me, or Churchill may not have held German Air Force back in World War II, and history would have turned out much differently. Side note, does that count as fulfillment of Godwin's law if I don't directly reference Hitler, I just reference the German Air Force?
And this, of course, filters out fairies and goblins, whereas God, on the other hand, created the world and all that is in it, therefore has ultimate authority over all of creation.
If he exists, then maybe he created it. First, you have to demonstrate that he exists. Otherwise, I can just claim that fairies and goblins created the world and everything in it, therefore they have ultimate authority over it. And as a side note, the act of creating something does not automatically give you ultimate authority over the thing you create. If we were able to create a true artificial intelligence that is conscious and sapient, would we have ultimate authority over it, or should it have rights of its own? Even if we don't go so far in abstract as artificial intelligence, what if I build a furniture set and then give it to my brother? I made it, I created it, do I have ultimate authority over it? No, I gave it to my brother, he has authority over it now. According to the Bible, God gave us the earth, so God no longer has ultimate authority over the earth or its contents. We do. Now, unfortunately, this is one line of thinking that leads to climate change denial, so personally I'd rather do away with the concept of a god altogether and just try to make the world a better place in the here and now.
Now, there are atheists who try to say that this isn't true, but of course they neglect their own argument in their daily lives.
Please elaborate.
For example, if you were to build a chair from scratch, you could decide what you wanted to do with that chair. You could decide whether you wanted to sit on it, stand on it, burn it, you could call it whatever you wanted. Now, of course, there's limitation because you are human, which is where God's omnipotence comes into play.
Yes, this goes back to the furniture example that I gave earlier. As long as you are in possession of it, you have authority over it. But as I pointed out, if you choose to sell it or give it away, then you lose that authority. By the same reasoning, we can also determine that you don't need to have created something from scratch in order to gain authority over it. I have plenty of chairs in my house that I did not create, yet if the people who did create them came knocking on my door and demanding that I hand them over, I wouldn't give the chairs to them. Why? Because I have the authority over the chairs, despite their creators having created them. I feel like this is a huge side trail, though. I thought you were going to be talking about how there's actual evidence for your god where there isn't evidence for Santa Claus or fairies. If the whole authority thing is what's getting you on this, then just replace Santa Claus with any other creation deity. There are hundreds of them. Why don't you believe in any of them? That's the real question, not which has more authority or which is more relevant. Do you apply the same standards of evidence to your own god as you do to the other gods that you agree don't exist? And would this include the gods that the Bible talks about as if they do actually exist, like the Egyptian gods? According to the Bible, the Egyptian gods did exist. The Hebrew god is just stronger.
The second question of relevance is, has this supernatural being utilized its authority?
Only if it exists can that even be possible. So demonstrate the existence of your god first, then we can talk about whether or not it has utilized its authority.
Has it communicated and preserved some sort of law to its creation? And this is where the Bible becomes a standalone document, not only because of its claim to be the direct word of God, but also because of its historical harmony with secular documents and its unity within itself, both of these proving its preservation.
There are plenty of holy books that claim to have come directly from God. That doesn't set the Bible apart in the slightest. Several of these books also document actual historical events as well, so that also doesn't set the Bible apart. And as far as unity within itself goes, the Bible falls laughably short. I think the Quran does a much better job, if only because of the principle of abrogation, in which if a contradiction appears, then whichever verse was written later is deemed to be the correct one. The Bible has no such defense, and the amount of mental squirming that must take place in order to supposedly clear up these contradictions is truly astounding. Now, at this point, I would like to mention that I went back to the original video that he's responding to in order to clarify something for one of my later points. In doing so, I found that he took this clip absolutely, completely, 100% out of context. Ricky Gervais was talking about agnostics, not Christians. His whole point was that agnostics are more annoying than theists because they're more wishy-washy in their stance. Basically, the whole section has been a complete straw man. But, don't trust me. Here's all of what Ricky had to say.
Agnostics annoy me more.
Oh yeah?
This new trendy little linguistic piece of logic that since neither can know, you've got to be agnostic. Well, okay, that's fair enough, but do you, follow the same rules with fairies and Santa? No, you don't. Would you tell your kid that we don't know if Santa exists or not? No, you wouldn't, And which God don't you know exists? Which one? Which one don't you know about?
Thor.
Exactly,
Apollo,
yeah. Well, I think, yeah. Well, that's the other thing as well. I'm an atheist. I don't believe in about 2,700 gods. Christians don't believe in 2,699.
Yes.
So they're nearly as atheistic as me.
Yes.
So it looks to me like the point you should have been addressing here was not, do you apply the same logic to Santa or fairies, but rather, how do you know that your God is the one true God, and that the other 2,699 gods are false? You said nothing that would address that.
I think that using the word God or the attitude of faith toward that which you don't know is a cop-out. It's a way of slapping a label onto something rather than trying to understand it.
Oh, kind of like the faith that you have in science to be able to give a naturalistic explanation for the origin of the universe, life, and information.
Except it's not faith if it's demonstrably true. Nobody sat in a room somewhere trying to think of an explanation for how the universe could work without a god. They just followed the evidence. Several of the most impactful scientific discoveries and hypotheses throughout history actually originated with Christians trying to understand how God works. And through our increased understanding, we eventually came to realize that he doesn't. Or at least he does so in a way that makes him look completely useless and, dare I say, irrelevant. Now, I'm generalizing here. I do understand that a significant chunk of scientists today still hold to religious beliefs, but it cannot be denied that the more scientifically educated someone becomes, the less likely they are to remain religious. There might just be a reason for that.
Even though the more we study these things, the more we see that they are far too complex to be explained naturally.
If that were the case, then why do we keep finding natural explanations for them?
And you cannot try to claim that these explanations already exist. Every single naturalistic theory for these origins breaks basic scientific law, like the law of biogenesis and the law of causality. You cannot get life from non-life, and you cannot get something from nothing.
The law of biogenesis is basically just a refutation of the hypothesis of spontaneous generation. It essentially says that complex life can't just spontaneously appear inside a corpse, as was believed before Louis Pasteur did his famous pasteurization experiment. It says nothing about the simple self-replicating organic molecules that would have eventually become the first simple life forms. As to the law of causality, who said we've got something from nothing? I mean, nobody knows what came before the Big Bang. It could be that the universe has always existed, just in its little tiny speck form. I don't see a problem with the universe having always existed. You, on the other hand, if you're going to say that everything needs to have a cause, then you need to answer, what caused God? If God has always been, then why can't the universe have always been? Oh, well, it's because God is outside space and time. God needs no cause. God is the cause. You know what it's called when you make an excuse for something to behave in a way that nothing else can? That's called special pleading, and it doesn't make for very convincing arguments.
People have a real fear of death, and they always have done, they always will do. And there are always people who can provide explanations for what happens. If you tell people they're looked after, it makes them feel better than if you tell them they're alone. So people who believe in reason on these things are always at a disadvantage because we don't have soft fairy tales.
Okay, here he is confusing the fear of death for the instinctual desire that you and I have for a world beyond this one.
Well, if you look at the title thing in the upper corner, it seems that they're discussing whether or not we should believe in angels. So in that context, he was simply saying that believing in these things can put people at a disadvantage. He was also cut off in mid-sentence in your video, though, so I went back to the original, and he does go on to say that we, meaning atheists, are actually the ones at a disadvantage because we can't take advantage of the credulous people by telling them what the angels have told us. So not really an atheist argument, just an argument against people who communicate with angels. I would also like to point out that Reverend Sam Randall agreed with him on that point. But back to the point you were making against your straw man, I wouldn't say we have an instinctual desire for an afterlife. I would say that we just can't comprehend what it is not to exist, so our pathetic little ape brains come up with stories about how you can live forever. The stories always vary by culture, but basically it's just an extension of our inability to understand non-existence. This is not necessarily a fear of death, but it can certainly be encouraged by a fear of death.
Which is why at 99% of funerals, they talk about how the person is hopefully in a better place.
I'd like to see your source for that 99%. Even so, I don't really find it very convincing. I mean, what else are you supposed to say at a funeral? Grieving loved ones don't really want to hear that, the person doesn't exist anymore and you'll never see them again.
And I guess that we're all thinking how sad it is that a man of such talent, of such capability for kindness, of such unusual intelligence, should now so suddenly be spirited away at the age of only 48, before he'd achieved many of the things of which he was capable, and before he'd had enough fun. Well, I feel that I should say nonsense. Good riddance to him, the freeloading bastard, I hope he's found.
There are tactful ways to have an atheist funeral, but it's generally just culturally accepted to say that they're in a better place. Also, side note, if 99% of funerals say that the person is in a better place, and only 1/3 of the world is Christian, and you believe in hell, then that makes almost 2/3 of funerals complete lies. If you were asked to speak at an atheist funeral, would you tell their loved ones that God is, right now, burning their flesh off and then causing it to regrow so that he can do it again and will continue this process for all eternity? Or would you maybe be a bit more sympathetic to them?
And this actually shows as evidence for the existence of God, because you and I intrinsically long for a place that is all good and lacking the evil that we see in this world.
I want my life to not suck, therefore God exists. That's a bit weak, don't you think? I mean, I'm pretty sure my kids' gerbils don't want their lives to suck either. Does that mean gerbil God exists?
So yes, belief in an afterlife does cater to this need, but he's also overlooking the fact that naturalism caters to the desire to please oneself without limitation.
And believing that you will live for an eternity in absolute bliss and pleasure without limit doesn't cater to that desire?
In other words, if there's no God, then there's really no ultimate law, and you can kind of just do whatever you want.
Well, there is no ultimate law. There are laws in the country that I live in, though, so I can't just do whatever I want if it breaks those laws. Also, if what I want to do doesn't hurt anybody, what's the problem?
Which is really what people want to hear.
You are convinced that every person believes that there's a God, and you are convinced of this because you are convinced that God has revealed this in the Bible. And my question was, how do you know that God has revealed anything?
Okay, so what the questioner does here is he mashes the two most crucial questions in Christian apologetics and combines it into one question. So the first question he implies here is, can you prove God exists? And that is followed directly by the question, can you prove that God has actually communicated with us? And although these are extremely complicated questions, I will attempt to answer them briefly. Now, although I cannot prove that the answer is yes to both these questions, I can show that beyond reasonable doubt, God does indeed exist, and he has communicated with us. Now, there are many arguments for the existence of God, but one of my favorites has to do with the source of information. For example, when you are reading a book, you know beyond reasonable doubt that somebody wrote the information down on that book. The ink didn't write the information itself. Somebody used the ink to put the information on the page. And no matter how long you spend studying the physical attributes of that ink, you will never be able to find a non-intelligent explanation for how the information got there.
This is true, and you're obviously meaning it to be an analogy for DNA. I covered it more in depth in a previous video, but in short, books have no mechanism for copying or changing their text. DNA does. We know of several different ways information can be added into DNA, and we've seen it happen, so the analogy doesn't quite work.
And in the same way, you and I each have a 3 billion letter long book inside of us called DNA.
And there it is. Like I said, a key difference between an actual book and our DNA is that an actual book doesn't make copies of itself or mutate. Although if you look at the history of the Bible, the books did mutate quite a bit from the earliest preserved copies to what's in the Bible today.
Which acts as a massive control panel for our entire body. And each letter is placed perfectly in order to allow this to happen.
No. Most of the letters are placed in such a way that they do nothing. Well, nothing that we can detect anyways. Maybe they do something, but they definitely don't code proteins. They may have a regulatory effect, but as far as we can tell, 75 to 95% of DNA does nothing, with the 75% estimate coming from the people who suspect that there is some regulation going on, and the 95% coming from the people who think that all non-coding DNA is junk.
DNA has a magnificent ability to command each and every protein inside of us to fold correctly in order to prevent disease and maintain basic bodily function.
Does this perfect DNA prevent genetic diseases too? Oh wait, if it did, they wouldn't exist now, would they? But I guess that's our fault for letting Adam and Eve sin or something. Isn't that usually the response to that?
So my question to every atheist is, why do you so quickly accept intelligence when it comes to words on a page, but when it comes to writing the most complicated system known to mankind, you refuse to let a divine foot in the door?
Well, let's say we found a book that was 95% gibberish that meant nothing in any language. Would you be more likely to attribute that to an intelligent author or a cat smashing the keyboard? Let's let autocorrect be the force of natural selection here. Any group of letters that's close to a word when the cat hits the spacebar turns into an actual word. Let the cat mash the keyboard long enough and I'm sure you'll get a few coherent sentences out of it. Does that mean that the cat meant to type those sentences? So basically, if I found a book that had as much gibberish in it as our DNA does, I would probably not attribute it to an intelligence.
And this leads me to the second question which was asked here, which was basically, has God communicated with us? And this is essentially a question of the validity of the Bible, considering its claim to be the very word of God. Now, there are many angles I can take when trying to prove the validity of the Bible, and I do not have nearly enough time to go into all of them, but I will leave links to multiple articles that address the subject in detail. I would, however, like to address one thing on the topic, and that is the most detailed prophecy of Jesus Christ in the entire Old Testament, and that can be found in Isaiah chapter 53.
Yeah, you know what? There is some striking imagery that seems to fit with the Jesus story in Isaiah 53. Let's just wait and see what you have to say about it.
In this chapter, Isaiah inscribes an airtight description of a man who pays the ultimate penalty for the sins of the world. This is exactly what Jesus experienced 800 years after the book of Isaiah was written. And it just so happens that the great Isaiah scroll was the most preserved of all the Dead Sea Scrolls. It contained all 66 chapters of the book of Isaiah from the copies that we previously had, which, by the way, were 1,000 years newer than the Dead Sea Scroll copies.
Well, I'd like to know if they preserved the chapter demarcations that didn't exist until 400 years ago, including the ones between chapters 52 and 53. The reason I ask is because at the end of chapter 52, it's part of the suffering and glory of the servant part of Isaiah, and it describes a man whose appearance was disfigured beyond that of any human being, and his form marred beyond human likeness. And that's not a description I ever remember hearing about Jesus. And in chapter 53, there's a problem with the second part of verse 5, which describes the servant being crushed, which is never described as happening to Jesus. Also in verse 9, he was apparently assigned a grave with the wicked. I seem to recall Jesus having his own tomb. In verse 10, it again says he was crushed, but more striking than that, it says he will see his offspring and prolong his days. Did Jesus have kids? Was Dan Brown right all along? I'll leave a link down below to a site that goes into great detail as to who this passage is actually about and why it's not Jesus.
And none of this is even mentioning the some 2,000 biblical prophecies that have been fulfilled throughout history.
Well, I hate to say it, but even if Isaiah 53 were an exact fit to Jesus, I'm afraid it just wouldn't count. As with the majority of the fulfilled Bible prophecies. Why? Because they're fulfilled within the Bible. I mean, Harry Potter fulfills the prophecy about him in the books, therefore the Harry Potter series must be true. It's easy to write a story that has a fulfilled prophecy in it. And what about all the prophecies that the Bible got wrong? Like Tyre, however you say it, the peninsula that was supposed to sink after being conquered, never to be rebuilt, which never sunk and was later rebuilt. And also wasn't conquered by Nebuchadnezzar like the Bible said it would be. It remained unconquered until Alexander the Great got to it 240 years later. And also there's the Ezekiel 29 prophecy about Egypt becoming a desolate waste where no foot of man shall pass through it, nor foot of beast pass through it for 40 years. This never happened. Egypt is also supposed to be diminished, a lowly kingdom after that. And while they're not a world superpower, they certainly aren't and never really have been lowly. And moving on to Ezekiel 30, verse 12 states that the Nile will be dried up and the land sold to evil men. That never happened. There's more, but I don't have time for that. I'll leave a link in the description for that too.
Sorry, atheists, I just don't have enough faith to believe that all that happened by coincidence.
And I don't have enough faith to believe that all the failed prophecies somehow don't count, so the Bible is still inerrant.
I mean, their best argument, ironically, is that it's just faith.
Pretty pathetic, then, isn't it?
Well, it is pathetic, but they mustn't ever engage in logic.
Okay, this might be the most annoying and unfair of all the atheist arguments. They are blatantly ignoring the fact that the founders of modern science, the vast majority of them, have been theists, and a lot of them have been Christians. Isaac Newton, Louis Pasteur, Galileo, Francis Bacon, the guy who literally came up with the scientific method.
Allow me to elaborate. It's not that theists don't use logic ever, it's that they can't really use logic when thinking about theological matters, because if they do, they'll eventually cease to be theists. This is called cognitive dissonance. It's the ability to hold on to contradictory positions simultaneously. So yeah, as I pointed out earlier, several of the greatest scientific achievements have been accomplished by theists. This does nothing for your position. In fact, it tends to detract from your position, as I have gathered from some things that you have said that you are a young Earth creationist, as several of the scientific ideas that definitely don't allow for a young Earth were put forth by Christians, including the Big Bang Theory itself.
And this has not ceased in modern times. You have people like Ravi Zacharias, William Lane Craig, Frank Turek. I mean, the list goes on and on and on of highly intellectual beings who believe in God and believe in Jesus Christ.
Ravi Zacharias is a professional apologist, not a scientist. William Lane Craig is a philosopher and apologist, not a scientist. Frank Turek is a Christian author, again, not a scientist. You were talking about scientists earlier when you were discussing great scientific breakthroughs made by religious people. Now you're switching to philosophy when you have to give modern examples. Could it be that now that it is more socially acceptable to be atheist, and now that we know so much more about the naturalistic explanations for how the world works, that people need to rely less on faith? But you know what? That's not actually true, because I'll do your job for you. Here are some amazing recent scientists who are or were Christian. Sir Robert Boyd was vice president of the Royal Astronomical Society. Richard Smalley won a Nobel Prize in chemistry for his discovery of buckyballs, which are a molecule in the fullerene class, and are one of the largest objects to have been shown to exhibit a wave-particle duality, and whose discovery led to the creation of an entirely new field of chemistry. Ben fucking Carson, who somehow manages to be a young Earth creationist despite being intelligent enough to have been the first neurosurgeon to successfully separate twins that were joined at the head. And I would be remiss not to mention Mary Schweitzer, who made the soft tissue discovery in T-Rex bones, and has been very vocal about it not being evidence for a young Earth. So there you go. Next time you need a list of actual scientists, you can use this one. It's only scratching the surface anyways. There's plenty more where that came from.
So no, atheists, you cannot claim to be the only ones who look at things objectively, the only rational ones.
I agree. I'll even go a step further. There are lots of irrational atheists out there. Rationality is not an automatic property of atheism. But that being said, there does tend to be a correlation.
Even Pew Research did a study a couple years back and found that 51% of scientists believe in some sort of higher power.
And also, according to Pew Research, 84% of the general population of the entire world have faith of some kind. So people with higher scientific education seem to have less religion by a huge margin of 33%. And if you're speaking specifically of American scientists, it's still a huge margin of 25%, with 76.5% of the general population being religious. So yeah, it seems that scientific education tends to lower belief in God or gods.
An important point here is that the less evidence there is for something, the more faith you have to believe it. And the reality is you have to have a lot more faith to be an atheist than you do to be a Christian.
Yes, it takes much more faith to believe in things that you can measure and predict than to believe in a magical man who somehow inexplicably lives outside of space and time, and so also somehow inexplicably doesn't need to have had a beginning, and he said a magic spell that caused the universe to exist. Earth first.
If what you believe is demonstrably false, and you want to pass it off as true in a science classroom, I have an issue with that.
Oh, I completely agree. Why don't you start with clearing the science classroom of the idea that natural selection can cause change between one animal type to another animal type and also gain genetic information in the process. These are things we can't even do using artificial selection.
Wow, you're wrong in so many ways there. I mean, are you including gene splicing in there, since that obviously adds genetic information? Or when you say artificial selection, do you just mean natural breeding of the organisms with the characteristics we're looking for, which also results in mutations that add genetic information? But that aside, we've observed genetic information being added into the genomes of various species. This isn't something that just happened millions of years ago that we can't see today. This is something that has been directly observed multiple times. I mean, if you know someone with Down syndrome, you know someone who has extra genetic information. Is it really that far-fetched to imagine that a mutation that results in this extra information could result in, say, immunity to a disease that's common in the population? Would that not give the organism with this extra information a survival advantage?
Maybe save that idea for like a secular religions classroom or something.
Oh, snap. I need me some aloe for that sick burn.
Religion isn't harmless. It's when your God starts telling you that you should kill homosexuals, and
exactly.
That's when it's not harmless anymore.
Yes, and what you're describing is called jihad, and it's Islamic extremism.
So the Bible doesn't say to kill gays? Leviticus 20:13 means something else then? Please elaborate.
So these have been some of the most common arguments from atheists.
Really? You're just going to say that killing gays is a purely Islamic thing and leave it at that? You're not going to go into any of the well-known verses against homosexuality in the Bible? Does that mean you're accepting of homosexuals? I mean, I hope so. That would be wonderful. That would be this video's one saving grace. But anyways, that's it for today. Remember to follow me on Twitter and support me on Patreon. See you next time.